So welcome everybody. My name is Lukman. I'm a member of the SJP at King's College London, and I'd like to welcome you to this event, which we've titled Gaza, Crisis, Cataclysm and Change, with our two esteemed guests, Jamie Stern-Weiner and Norman Finkelstein. Jamie Stern-Weiner is a graduate student in Middle East Studies at the University of Oxford. He's a dual British-Israeli national and a freelance researcher and editor of several books, including most recently Deluge, Gaza and Israel, from Chaos to Cataclysm, published by OR Books just a month ago, which we've got a copy here, and we'll be hearing much more about this talk as well. Alongside him will be Norman Finkelstein, who's one of the foremost scholars on Israel-Palestine, and few, if any, scholars have chronicled the crimes committed against Gaza so forensically and meticulously. He's written numerous books, including Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom and image and reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I'd like to welcome both of our speakers to this talk. And just a bit of a backdrop, we've been trying to secure this event since last October. As you can imagine, Norman's been busy bringing his characteristic scholarly precision and moral clarity, directly battling a deluge of propaganda spewed by the likes of Alan Dershowitz, Bernie Morris, Rabbi Shmuley, and Destiny, as well as numerous speaking engagements and rallies and encampments across the country. Meanwhile, Jamie has been hard at work putting together this book that we just mentioned, Deluge, which came out last month, and successfully submitting his PhD thesis at the University of Oxford. But that's not a complaint, because perhaps this conversation could not come at a more opportune time, where amidst, as the book puts it, the crisis and unfolding catastrophe and cataclysm, the viability of political and social change have also opened up. And perhaps that's no more evident than the student solidarity encampments that have been sweeping both sides of the Atlantic. And here at King's College London as well, we also launched an encampment 2 days ago. So before we begin the talk and discussion, we would like a little update from the encampment itself, a little bit about the objectives, how it's going right now, and what are the aims. So can I request someone from the encampment to unmute themselves and give us a little update there? Okay, what we'll do is that we'll get the update at the end. We're still dealing with some audio and video issues on site. Since we only launched 2 days ago, we patched together some equipment that we could have the conversation over. So I think we'll have that sorted by the end. So we'll jump straight into the talk. So we'll hand over to Jamie Stern-Weiner first. Jamie, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Lukman, for organizing this, for inviting me to speak, and of course to everyone for tuning in. I do hope we'll be able to get that update on the KCL encampment later, because I'll be very interested to hear how things are going. And I'll just register on that note at the outset that I've been really inspired and heartened by the student demonstrations, the encampments, and the wider popular mobilizations in London and elsewhere, in Britain and elsewhere around the world as well. Actually, they brought to my mind something that Noam Chomsky often says about political activism in the United States in the 1960s, those famous popular movements against war, for civil rights, for women's rights, and so on. He's often said that they civilized the country. And Chomsky also often has recalled how US elites at the time interpreted that civilizing ferment. Namely, they fretted about what they called the crisis of democracy and strategized about ways to force the newly energized, mobilized public back into its box. And I think those contrary trends, on the one hand, really unprecedented popular mobilization for justice, and on the other, this ratcheting up of repression, or at least delegitimization, seem to capture as well important aspects of the current moment. There are, of course, critical differences too. The movements back then took place at a time in general and overall of economic improvement, whereas for most of the people participating in protests today, the opposite is the case. And of course, now people are mainly protesting on behalf of another society, another people being brutalized a world away. But the stakes, I think, are similar and of a similar magnitude. Luqman suggested that I draw on the various contributions to Deluge, the book on Gaza, to present some of the crucial historical and political context for what's now happening. And that seems an especially appropriate exercise today, given that it commemorates 76 years since the Nakba, the Palestinian expulsion. And then Professor Finkelstein, if he wants, can perhaps focus on current developments and prospects. So I want to use the rest of my opening comments to highlight three central threads running through the contributions to the book that I think really illuminate the current moment and how we got here. The first point bears repeating. The Gaza Cataclysm, it didn't start in October 2023, and it didn't start with that Hamas attack, however shocking and brutal that was. On the contrary, the attack and Israel's genocidal offensive that has unfolded since, with the results, and in most respects, the predictable and predicted results of literally decades of multi-layered, unresolved, festering injustice. There was, of course, as already alluded to, the expulsion of some 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and homeland in 1948 to make way for the establishment of the State of Israel. Around 250,000 of those displaced people fled to Gaza. We often read and hear rightly that Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. Well, that's how it got that way. Those refugees from the 1948 expulsion and their descendants, they now make up more than 70% of Gaza's population. In 1967, that's more than a half century ago now, Israel effectively annexed Gaza, but didn't extend any rights of citizenship to the people that lived there, which means that for more than half a century, you've got a whole population living at the whim and at the caprice of a hostile foreign military, essentially dictatorship. And furthermore, they've been given no avenue, no route, no timeline for an end to that status and for an achievement of their right of self-determination. In 2006, that's nearly 2 decades ago, Israel sealed the Gaza enclave off and imposed an illegal economic blockade on it. And that blockade, it just eliminated the economy by design. It turned Gaza into what the International Committee of the Red Cross termed a sinking ship, and what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called a toxic slum, in which more than 2 million people, half of them children, were caged from birth to death. Those descriptions refer, it bears underlining, to the situation in Gaza that prevailed on October 6th last year. Finally, on top of all of that, the dispossession, the annexation, the siege, Israel also carried out, as Professor Finkelstein has documented in more minute detail than anyone, since 2008, Israel carried out periodic massacres designed, among other things, to keep the inmates of the Gaza prison camp in line. Those recurrent bloodlettings were designed, in the conclusion of one United Nations inquiry, to punish, humiliate, and terrorize Gaza's civilian population. So that's the kind of long but also current context I think it's important to bear in mind. And I think it's important to do so for two main reasons. Firstly, it renders explicable, I think wholly explicable, the origins of the current catastrophe. And second, it shows why, as important as it is to demand a ceasefire, merely a ceasefire with or without a hostage exchange, it's not going to be enough, even if it could be achieved. It won't be sufficient to end the problem, end the crisis, and prevent a renewed escalation. Why? Because it would simply amount to returning the people of Gaza to and continuing to confine them in that toxic slum, that sinking ship, and those decades after decades of violated rights. So, as well as putting the current horror into the context of much longer standing injustices, the contributors to the book, they also show that in the years and in the decades, in fact, leading up to October of last year, there were many, many off-ramps which could have been taken, and which, if they had been taken, would almost certainly have led us to a much less violent and dangerous place than where we now find ourselves. And specifically, Israel, Britain, the EU, and the United States had chance after chance after chance over decades to resolve the conflict, not just between Israel and the Palestinians, but between Israel and the whole region, long before things ever reached this bloody denouement. So if we look at the diplomatic record, Colter Lewis, he's an excellent researcher, recently got his PhD on this topic from the University of Exeter. In his chapter in the book, he authoritatively shows, based on the archival record, that the mainstream Palestinian leadership, it was then the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, it was willing to settle the conflict based on international law as far back as the mid-1970s. And furthermore, Israel and the US were well aware of this. So Coulter quotes in his chapter, the consensus judgment of all major
After 10 minutes. Gracias.
Of all major US intelligence agencies in 1981. This was an internal report subsequently declassified, presenting the consensus conclusions of every major US intelligence body. And they all agreed on 2 points, and I'll just quote from Coulter's chapter. The first point was that in exchange for independent Palestinian statehood, Palestinian leaders were prepared to recognize Israel's right to exist and would also agree to a process leading to more formal recognition, which is to say, they were prepared to resolve the conflict on the basis of the internationally agreed two-state framework. Point number 2, that Israeli politicians across the spectrum, from Likud on the right to Labour on the left, were united in broad agreement that Israel would not withdraw to its legal borders and would not negotiate with the Palestinian leadership, even if that leadership recognized Israel and renounced violence. So that was some 4 decades ago, but the basic picture remained the same. Palestinians and the Arab states supported a resolution of the conflict based on international law, and Israel and the US stood virtually alone, virtually isolated in rejecting it. And it's important to add, as Coulter shows, and also as the Palestinian scholar Khalid Hrub shows in his chapter, that this basic story didn't really change much after the election of Hamas in January 2006. In the aftermath of that election, the Hamas government repeatedly indicated to Europe, to what was then called the Middle East Quartet, to the United States, it repeatedly indicated a willingness on its part to try to reach a resolution of the conflict through negotiations. Now, what it would have eventually agreed to had those negotiations taken place, unfortunately has to remain an open question, because instead of pursuing those possibilities, Israel, the US, and the EU systematically spurned and sabotaged them. So on the diplomatic level, we can say with high confidence that the conflict could have been resolved already a long, long time ago, meaning that the current horrors never had to happen. So that's diplomacy. What about on the strategic level? Well, there too alternatives to violence existed, were attempted, and unfortunately failed in the face of unyielding intransigence from Israel, enabled by its key allies, including, of course, the British government. I'm referring here mainly to developments which took place in Gaza in 2018, not so long ago, but sadly often unmentioned or forgotten in the context of what's happening now. In 2018, especially between March and May of that year, for week after week, tens of thousands of people in Gaza gathered along that perimeter fence, marching, chanting, singing, sitting in for their rights as refugees and for an end to the criminal Israeli blockade that was suffocating them, that had destroyed the economy. They called it the Great March of Return. And one of the contributions to the book, it goes through the reports. There were many reports issued by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, leading international Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations. And as the chapter shows, they all agreed that the protesters in Gaza in 2018 were overwhelmingly unarmed. And all those human rights investigations also agreed on what Israel did in response to them. Namely, it lined up its snipers on its side of that prison fence, and faced with those overwhelmingly unarmed demonstrators, they just methodically shot them down. Not only did Israel's international enablers and accomplices fail to sanction it for that crime, but Western media, leading Western media outlets, misrepresented the Gaza protests as if they had been violent. And they also misrepresented Israel's massacre of them as if it had been an exercise of in self-defense. And those media misrepresentations, they had a really damaging effect because they prevented that Great March of Return from resonating in Western public opinion as it might otherwise have done, to the extent that it otherwise might have done. And in the face of that external indifference, Israeli soldiers were at liberty to shoot them down. And so the non-violent option in Gaza, it was crushed. Now, even as the current catastrophe has these historical roots, there are also important aspects of the crisis that are historically new. In fact, I think your own student encampment reflects and embodies one of them. And perhaps some of those will come up in the discussion. But rather than go through them now, I'll end more or less where I began. In the US, we've seen Sleepy Joe, as he's called, transmogrify into Genocide Joe, dropping a few aid packages on Gaza alongside billions of dollars worth of US-made and US-financed missiles. We've also seen him pretending to doubt the veracity of the astonishing numbers of people killed in Gaza, even as his own State Department has historically relied on the same sources as are producing those figures. As the historian Avi Schleim has said, perhaps it would be better if Genocide Joe went back to sleep. We've also seen institutions like the New York Times prove as powerless to discern who started the violence on campuses in New York as it has been to identify who's been dropping bombs in Gaza. Meanwhile, in Britain, the famous human rights lawyer, Der Starmer, that greased quiff who now leads the Labour Party, he ordered Labour MPs to stay away from Palestine solidarity marches. He called for a phony, sustainable ceasefire that only sustained Israel's bombing. He publicly endorsed Israel's right to cut off vital supplies to Gaza's civilian population. Starmer's recently taken to denying his calculated defense of Israel's right to commit genocide. The fact that he's bothering to deny it, by the way, is an index that all these demonstrations are having an effect politically. But in the book, the excellent London writer and activist Talal Hangari, he provides all the receipts. The upshot, I think, is this. If, as I've summarized, Israel has been violating Palestinian rights for decades, if Israel has systematically rejected any diplomatic resolution of the conflict, even as one has been on the table for decades, if Israel's made any non-violent way out for the Palestinian people under its boot impossible, if in short, Israeli repression and international impunity for it have predictably brought us all to this point of regional war, while Israeli forces are even now in broad daylight carrying out what the International Court of Justice found is plausibly a genocide, then it's no wonder Israel's now experiencing an unprecedented crisis of international legitimacy. And given our own elites' complicity in these crimes and the brazen deceptions they've resorted to cover that complicity up, it's also no surprise that their own legitimacy is being shaken as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amy. Probably can't see them in the hall. They've been clapped, so I think they went indoors for this particular event. Thank you very much. And again, the essays that Jamie mentioned and others are in this book called Deluge, Gaza and Israel, From Crisis to Cataclysm. We will now pass on to our second guest, Norman Finkelstein. So Norman, whenever you're ready.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And of course, my genuinely humble admiration for the young people who are putting their futures, their presents and their futures on the line for a stateless, powerless, tiny population, relatively speaking, far, far away from where they're currently residing, and which they could easily have ignored if they so chose. So my humble appreciation and admiration for their efforts. In the time that that's allocated to me, I'm just going to briefly go through some of the points of contention that have arisen in the course of the past 6.5 months, what you might call the questions frequently asked, and which seem to cause a certain amount of perplexity on all sides. And if not perplexity, maybe sometimes a too facile, a too easy response to questions which are, I think, morally complicated, though I also believe you can reach a provisional answer to them, which is tenable. So let's begin with the most basic questions. You might call them the Piers-Morgan questions. So first of all, as everybody listening knows, especially since it's mostly a British audience, the first question is, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? I would say, in answer to that question, first of all, there has to be precision to the extent that it's possible and accuracy to the extent it's possible about what happened on October 7th. Based on what people like Jamie has informed me, because I freely admit I didn't watch any of the video footage of October 7th, and I don't really trust much of what's come out in the way of commentary. I will freely say I don't believe a single word Israel says, and I'll also say I don't believe a single word Hamas says about what happened October 7th. Having said that, I would say it's clear that Hamas's intention was to deal a shattering blow to the status quo. I would say it's clear that they targeted military installations and intelligence installations. I would say it's clear that they intended to take hostages, though it's unclear whether they intended to take military and civilian hostages, or they intended to take military hostages and then improvised and took also civilian hostages. I would say, even though it's not 100% clear, it's close to, let's just call it a high probability that they intended to commit a civilian massacre, although the scale of that massacre is very hard to determine. The numbers, the ultimate numbers, I think have been verified, 850 civilians. It's unclear what percentage were killed in the course of crossfire, but still, I think there was an intention to commit a massacre, but the dimensions, the scale of the massacre are unclear. So I think that's a starting point, though I want to emphasize, without in any way denying what I just said, I have to qualify it by saying I still think what happened is very murky, both in terms of the factual side, but also what were the intentions on Hamas's side. And I also believe, but I can't prove it, it's purely speculative, that it was a spontaneous decision to launch the operation at that moment. Why I believe that, if people are interested, they can ask me, but I do believe it was not intended for that moment. They prepared, we know, for about 2 years, but I think the date chosen was not thought through very carefully. There are many reasons to suspect that, but the most obvious reason is they had to know that it was going to have repercussions with the Hezbollah and Iran, yet all the available intelligence information so far indicates they never told them. So I find it hard to believe they would have made a decision like that with preparation, without having communicated that decision to what they had to know would be two critical, let's call it players, even though I hate that word in this context, but two critical players in whatever unfolded subsequently. So, do I condemn what happened on October 7th? I don't think there's a significant factual disagreement between myself and what you might call the Israeli side. On the factual question, I think one could say there is more common ground than disagreement. I don't really believe there's a significant legal question either. If atrocities occurred, then legally they have to be held accountable for the atrocities they concerned. You might say you would call for clemency, you would call for mitigation, for given where they came from and what they had to endure. But as a legal matter, I think it's pretty straightforward. But then there is, it seems to me, a third consideration. We have the factual consideration, we have the legal consideration, and there's a third consideration, which is a moral judgment. Do I condemn? I'm not being asked as a jurist. I'm being asked as a human being. Do I condemn? And my answer, without going through the details, is going to be very simple. I was put in a very strange position when October 7th happened, because I had spent about 15 years chronicling all the details of the preceding horrors that had been visited on the people of Gaza. And having spent so much time with the detail, not just presenting what's commonly called nowadays a narrative, a word I detest, but we'll set that aside. But I had been engaged with the details. And the details, you know the expression, the truth is to be found in the details. And when you read these human rights reports from very mainstream organizations, by the way, documenting things like people carrying white flags who are shot down, documenting drone missiles where the person directing the missile, it's like a computer game, though I confess I've never played a computer game, that's factually correct, but it's like a computer game where they have the camera and they're directing the drone attack, and it's being directed on at children on a rooftop. and they have a perfectly clear image of where they're directing the missile. And they have the option, as Human Rights Watch reported, they have the option up until the last minute of diverting the missile. The missile could be within, the distance of your forehead. It's that close, and you still have the option of diverting it. Now, I'm quoting from Human Rights Watch, which, by the way, was quite apologetic of Israel until quite recently. It was actually dreadful. A lot of my writing was criticizing the apologetics of Human Rights Watch. But they put out a report, and as I say, kids playing on the rooftop, directing the drone missile, seeing everything up close, and proceeding to kill them. Then you have descriptions of ambulances. Oh, they attack a family, no clear, there's no Hamas members in sight, no Hamas members inside. They kill a family. Okay, that's old news for Israel, killing civilians without any justification. But then there's a second part. The Israeli drones or planes, they hover outside. They wait for the people who survived, the survivors, to come into the street. And then when they're gathered in the street, they're waiting for the ambulance. And then when the ambulance arrives, they then fire again at the ambulances and the people waiting for the ambulances. Now, that's not once, that's not twice, that's not 3 times. When you go through the reports, it's over and over and over again. You have kids who are dying, and Israel blocks the ambulances from reaching them. Well, you can imagine, after 15 years of reading thousands, if not tens of thousands of reports like that, it's very hard to condemn those folks who broke through the gates of Gaza concentration camp on October 7th. I just gave details from the periodic Israeli massacres in Gaza, but then there's just the overall ambiance, if we can use that word in this context. And that is, the best chronicler of that is Sarah Roy, who's devoted her entire adult life to chronicling the economic side of what's been done to Gaza, which began actually in as far back as 1991, when Israel began instituting what it called a closure policy in Gaza. And that closure policy, it's kind of like how the Warsaw Ghetto was formed. No, the ghetto wasn't, the Warsaw Ghetto, I'm referring now to World War II, it's not like they created a ghetto overnight. They did it step by step by step. And the closure policy was implemented began in 1991. By 2004, Israel's chief of the National Security Council, the head of the National Security Council, he casually described Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp. Now, that's before what Jamie referred to earlier as the imposition of this brutal economic blockade on Gaza, which Richard Goldstone in his report, the Goldstone Report, described as, in aspects of it, a crime against humanity. And so there was the systematic, the methodical destruction of the economy of Gaza, to the point that at this moment in time, before October 7th, there was no economy in Gaza. There was no functional economy in Gaza. It was basically a leper colony, what Israel had created there, or a concentration camp, whichever you would say. So the long and the short of it is, once you're familiar close up with the details of what life was like in Gaza, it's very hard to condemn those, whatever they did on October 7th. And I would say, just by way of comparison, that the difference between what happened in Gaza and, say, the slave revolts in our own country, meaning the United States, the difference is the abolitionists were very careful about condemning the slave revolts, even though they were quite brutal. But in their case, everybody saw the horrors of slavery right before their eyes. They saw the auction blocks. The auction blocks were in broad daylight, where they auctioned off black slaves to wannabe slaveholders. They saw the degradation, the whipping, the going through the streets in chains. It was all visible. So the abolitionists did not have a very difficult time, if you believe in the equality of human life, they did not have a very difficult time having to prove that what's done to the slaves is wrong, and that their rebellions, you may not like the results of those rebellions, but those rebellions were inevitable given the conditions. What makes Gaza different is nobody saw that. How many people read the human rights reports? I think literally you can count them the number of fingers on hands and toes who plowed through those reports. They just did not read them. So all you saw were insane Hamas, fanatical, anti-Semitic, jihadi, so on and so forth, breaking through the gates. I saw something different because I saw the slaves. I saw the slaves in real time, in real life, which most people did not. And that's why perhaps my answer differed from most other guests when they were asked that question. That became a kind of gatekeeper's question. If you didn't say, yes, you condemn it, then you were no longer part of the civilized discussion. And I was very clear in my mind from day one that I was not going to condemn it, even as I acknowledge the horrors that, to use the words of the abolitionists, the horrors that occurred during the slave rebellion. The second question that's asked is, well, what did you expect Hamas to do? That's become the new question. What did you expect Israel to do? That became the new question. That's what you might call, with no offense to the guys, because I like them, but the trigonometry question. What did you expect Israel to do, or what was Israel supposed to do? And there I say it's probably correct to say we can have disagreements over it, but I think it's correct to say that Israel had a legal right to react to what happened on October 7th. They had that legal right, and I don't want to quarrel about it. We can go over what Article 51 on the UN Charter says and whether that's an exhaustive argument or not. I don't want to get into those details. That's for lawyers, and I don't pretend to be a lawyer. I've studied the law, but I don't pretend to be a lawyer. I would say legally they probably had the right, but I would say my opinion is morally they forfeited the right. After what you did to those people, you have forfeited the right of self-defense. Now, it might be said, and it's probably correct, in the real world, that argument is not going to wash. Most people are going to say, after the atrocities that occurred, Israel had to respond and had a right to respond. I do not believe they had the right to respond, but I can understand people believing that. Then you have a choice, and the choice is that you can respond by obeying the laws of war or not obeying the laws of war. Israel clearly chose not to obey the laws of war. Now, I would also, that would bring me to the third common question, namely that if there's a lot of death, there's a lot of destruction in Gaza. That's because of Hamas orchestrating the death and destruction, because it wants civilians to be killed and it wants there to be destruction. What Alan Dershowitz, in a not very felicitous phrase, he calls the dead babies strategy. What I would say to that question is, and it pertains to the nature of the whole operation in Gaza. We can call it operation, another word I detest. You're going to have a long list of words I detest by the time I'm finished. I think that's a misunderstanding of what the operation in Gaza is all about. The operation in Gaza is not to target Hamas. Even if Hamas purposely was situating itself in places so as to evoke or provoke this Israeli reaction, even if they purposely put the tunnels under the hospitals, even if they purposely put the tunnels under the universities, even if they were purposely using Palestinians as human shields, even if that were all true, I know I'll be saying a statement now that will shock many of your listeners, I think it's totally irrelevant, because Israel was not targeting Hamas. The biggest misnomer of the war, Israel won, incidentally. Israel won 99% of the propaganda war by convincing the whole of the mainstream media to describe what happened after October 7th as, quote, the Israel-Hamas war. The moment you characterized it, and every single media outlet, bar none, every single media outlet, bar none, has called it the Israel-Hamas war. The moment that was accepted as the descriptive of what's going on, Israel won 99% of the propaganda war. There was no alternate or totally different, again, to use the new expression, lens through which to look at the conflict. And that lens, so to speak, was exhaustively documented by South Africa. Namely, it wasn't an Israel-Hamas war. The whole point of South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice was to say this was a genocide. It wasn't targeting Hamas. It was targeting the whole population of Gaza. And if that was Israel's aim, not Hamas, but the whole population of Gaza, then it's completely irrelevant whether there were tunnels there, whether Palestinians were using human shields, so on and so forth, because even if there were no tunnels, even if Hamas weren't using Palestinians as human shields and all the rest, Israel would have carried out the exact same strategy. Why? Because it wasn't targeting in the first place Hamas. It was targeting the civilian population of Gaza, of which at this point, incidentally, there's no longer any serious dispute. Now, there was some dispute when South Africa first brought its application before the International Court of Justice about whether this was a genocide, for which you have to demonstrate, as everybody knows, you have to demonstrate genocidal intent, whether it was a genocide or was Israel, so to speak, merely violating the laws of what's called the laws of war, international humanitarian law. That's no longer in dispute, because beginning in November, Human Rights Watch was saying that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war. That's now been confirmed, verified multiple times. That your own EU foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, he said they're using famine as a weapon of war. Once it's established firmly that you're trying to starve the population to death, there is no longer any question of genocidal intent. That issue is resolved now among the broad mainstream. There's a current article in the New York Review of Books by a well-known human rights personality. I detest the guy, but he has his credentials, his bona fides. He said, when South Africa first brought this case before the court, I didn't believe it. I thought maybe Hamas was partly responsible because of its tactics. I thought, of course, Israel was partly responsible, but he wouldn't go to genocide, okay? But then, and this was also the position of the German judge in the ICJ. He wouldn't go to genocide, okay? But now if you read the most recent statement by Nolte, the German judge, he says, once I started to read that Israel was using starvation as an intentional method to cause starvation, and Aryeh Neher, the personality I mentioned to you earlier from the New York Review of Books, he too said, now I'm convinced if you're targeting a population for famine, if you're targeting humanitarian organizations which are trying to bring food to the famished population, there's no other way to conclude that there is a plausible case. I would say now it's more than plausible, a plausible case for genocide. That all being said, it seems to me this argument about it's Hamas tactics that are responsible for the horrors that are unfolding, the civilian horrors are unfolding in Gaza, I would say that argument is no longer tenable. And with that, I think I've gone way over my time, and I'm going to just stop there. I think I brought to bear some new facts and information, which is my responsibility, and then let's proceed with the your itinerary.
No, thank you very much, Norman, for that analysis. I mean, so with Jamie covered the crisis aspect of it since the Nakba, you covered the cataclysm of the last 7 months and the justifications that are used to perpetuate this over the last 7 months. Can you quickly, briefly touch on that final point, change? Do you see any hope of change from your experience of speaking over the country? Has there been a shift in discourse and dialogue over the last 7 months, and your feelings of going to the encampment and the resolve among the students there to continue no matter what, come what may? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, you start with the basic. If you don't do anything, you can say with certainty nothing is going to change. So anybody who counsels either from maliciousness or cynicism or even hopelessness, anyone who says it's pointless to do anything, I have to say, then you have just signed a death warrant for a population, half of whom are children. And I do not believe that is a morally tenable position. As to what we can do now, my view is that it's impossible. There's no formula that can, if you plug in numbers, that can tell you what we can or can't do, because it's a complex process until you reach what's, the common expression that's used, until you reach critical mass. And the critical mass has 1,000 different factors. You have, right now, I would say you have the factors of what's going on in the International Court of Justice. It's a factor. Is it a decisive factor? Of course not. But even those who are leading the charge in the ICJ, like John Dugard, he will frankly admit in the past, the case of South Africa in various incarnations, of which Jamie is even by now a better expert than me, but in various incarnations, the litigation in the ICJ, believe it or not, on South Africa, believe it or not, it lasted over 2 decades, from 1950 to 1971. They went before the court. There were 6 different cases, or 6 meetings for the same basic case over a long period. Huge investment of energy, huge investment of resources. But if you ask Dugard, was it the ICJ proceedings that brought down apartheid? He said, of course not. It played a role. It played a part. There was the civil uprisings in South Africa. There was the international anti-apartheid movement. There were the legal proceedings. There were the student revolts. I was in that era. I was very active at Princeton University. We were denouncing, it was Bowen. He was the president of Princeton. Bowen, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide. And there was a group of people every day marching in front of the main hall at Princeton on that thing. So there was a huge number of different things happening in different places. And ultimately, I'm not going to allocate praise which work better than which. I think they all contribute. I do believe one person holding a sign in a town square in a small town, it plays a part. I do believe that. I'm not just saying that as a cliche or to lift people's spirits. Each of these things helps percolate the mass movement. And I think there have been some, they're minimal, there have been some adjustments in US policy. They might be minimal, they might be marginal, they might be minute. But I say this, do you mind if I ask you your name?
Lukman.
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 Lukman. You love life? For sure. I love life? For sure. You cling to life? I cling to life. Everybody listening, however miserably life has turned out, for each of the listeners, with some exceptions, those who eventually opt for suicide, with those exceptions aside, most people love life, cling to life, and ponder the mystery of life, try to make sense of it for themselves, trying to figure out how to navigate life's journey. And if all our efforts yield one more life, it might be your own. And if you love your life, remember the life that's saved, it might be your own. To my mind, that's enough. That's enough to justify all our efforts. It means I can live. So at that minimal level, if you appreciate the mystery and the value of human life, that should be sufficient for everybody to be out there and giving their all. Do I see something better on, say, the political horizon? Honesty forces me to say no. I think it's a very bleak moment politically because I don't see the terms for resolving the conflict at this point. I don't think the pieces are forget about the pieces being in place. I don't know what the pieces would consist of at this point. So in the absence of a discernible objective or goal, it's very hard to be optimistic now. But in the short term, the slogan that the students have seized on, a permanent ceasefire now, I would add to that ending the blockade of Gaza. A permanent ceasefire and ending the blockade of Gaza are quite sufficient, in my opinion, to motivate all of us and give our all to ending that nightmare in Gaza.
Thank you very much for that moving and poignant and realistic message. I think with the numbers that we see on television every day, updating of how many deaths overnight, I think we kind of lose track of the value of each individual human life as well. But anything we can do in the direction of that is completely worth it. So we've delivered to the promise of the title of the event, the crisis, cataclysm, and change. We will now turn to our encampment group. So are we able to get an update about the encampment before we move on to perhaps get a couple questions before we end? If there's no response in 15 seconds, I'll just give the update.
Mr. Norman Finkelstein, we thank you very much as an encampment and student body. The encampment is now in its third day. We have received one piece of information communication from the university, very minimal in its scope, essentially confirming our thoughts that they want us to remain and they see us as no nuisance as long as we don't disturb the civility of the university. However, we have now been barred from inviting speakers, but we are still strong and we will carry on. As you elucidated, every university is complicit and KCL is no exception, and we have charged them with genocide. And as a student body, we're willing to stay here until that changes in some minimal way. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you for doing what you're doing, not for me. And if for the people of Gaza in particular, it's for humanity in general to remind future generations that it's a memory. You know, I was reading the other day an article by the great revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg. And she said, for a revolutionary movement, you never really have defeats. For a revolutionary movement, each what seems like a defeat is not actually a defeat if you learn the right lessons from what appears to be a defeat. And she made the point, which never occurred to me, that she said, every defeat is also an inspiration for future generations. So if you're part of the left movement, most of what we commemorate and are inspired by were actually defeats. We commemorate the Paris Commune. It was put down in blood. We commemorate the Spanish Civil War. It was defeated. Each defeat actually becomes a source of inspiration for if you feel yourself part of the revolutionary tradition. Each defeat, first of all, it provides lessons, because as a revolutionary movement, the most important thing in any radical movement is self-criticism and course correction. Study what went right, but study even more closely what went wrong. What did you do wrong? Study it closely. Learn the lessons. So from every defeat, there are lessons to be learned. And the self-criticism, feel strong enough to say we did that wrong. We have to acknowledge that we did that wrong. And secondly, once you acknowledge you made an error, to not let your pride get the best of you and to make a course correction. If a slogan on reflection seems not to have been a great slogan, then don't say, well, that slogan is part of our venerable movement, and we're going to stay loyal to the slogan. No. If you've determined the slogan is bad, swallow your pride and revise the slogan. Even if the other side can claim victory, you see, we coerce them into changing that slogan. We force them to acknowledge they were wrong. Yes, they will do that, but that's irrelevant to us. For us, we're revising the slogan because we want to win. And if we're making an error, correct the error. Now, if you don't believe you're making an error, of course, you're not obliged to correct. But you can't stick to old tactics just because they've become venerable. You have to learn from your mistakes. Now, I'll just stay, if you've confirmed their mistakes. I'll only say one last thing. First of all, the speaker said that the university said we can continue the encampment so long as we don't make a hullabaloo. Well, I don't agree with that. The whole point of freedom of assembly is to bring to light horrors which would otherwise not be known. The point of freedom of assembly is to make a hullabaloo. That's the whole point of it. I was listening to a Cornell University Jewish student, Cornell University being one of the Ivy League students in the United States, and she was very condemnatory of demonstrations. And she kept saying over and over again, all they want is publicity. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what's called freedom of assembly. You're trying to publicize a horror that's unfolding. And of course, all she wanted was to suppress knowledge of the horror. So I don't accept that you have to be quiet, tame, you have to be restrained, but there's a second side. You have to always be careful of not alienating the broad mass of the university. You may not have their active support, and many of them may be indifferent, but you don't want to lose them. You don't want to lose them. You have to figure out ways to have a real presence on campus, so you don't just fade into the woodwork. You have a real presence on campus, but you also don't alienate the overwhelming majority of the student population. You have to find that balance.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time to take one question from the encampment audience. So if I'm going to pass the mic to anyone who wants to ask a question, I think we'll wrap up after that. Thank you.
No one from our side has questions, but I think as one general question, speaking on behalf of everybody, what mistakes have you seen from other encampments that you've been to, Mr. Norman, that you would advise us to stay away from?
Well, first of all, I've not been to a lot of encampments. I would say the one that most impressed me was the one at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. and the students were very serious and very smart. They tailor, because MIT is a technology university, it has huge amounts of connections with the military. It's effectively the military farming out its research to universities like MIT and Caltech. So what they did was they formulated very narrow demands where there was a clear, indisputable, irrefutable connection with Israel that you can't get around, and it made their demands very tenable because they were so precise in what they targeted. So that I thought was very well done. I would say there has been a certain inflexibility, which is understandable under the circumstances. There was a certain inflexibility on this question of slogans, and there was a kind of pride that since the other side has drawn a red line on from the river to the sea, for that reason, we are not going to modify one word, one punctuation mark. The more you say no, the more we say yes. I can get that, but I think that the error there is the issue is not them. You're not trying to satisfy them. You're not trying to dissatisfy them. They are not your audience. They are already dug in deep on their views, and you're never going to change their mind. So if you were to say from the river to the sea, Arabs can live there, but Jews will be in charge, that still won't satisfy them. You know? So forget that. The point is the course correction is for the growth of your movement, trying to reach people. And if their argument is persuading a large amount of the public that the real goal of this movement is to kill all Jews or to create an Arab state in which Jews have to leave, if they're managing to persuade large amounts of the public, people you want to win over, then you have to make the decision whether there's some fundamental principle here that you refuse to concede, or whether there's a way of recrafting the slogan in such a way as no principle is conceded, but you will also be able to counter the claims being made against you.
Thank you, Norman. So before we wrap up, any final message for our students and campers from Jamie and then Norman, and then we'll close there. Jamie, are you still there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely. Go for it.
Just to say, again, just really well done on what you're doing. I wish you all the strength. The only other observation I would make, in terms of tactics and strategy is, I have been impressed with how people have been trying to strike a different balance, which can be also tricky, between focusing on your core mission, your core objectives, namely what's happening in Gaza, but also keeping an ear out and trying to resonate with broader frames, to use the word that Norman probably hates as well, broader issues that other constituencies really care about. So, I mean, in the United States right now, for example, there's a controversy around the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was adopted by the House of Representatives, which basically encodes into law the Israel lobby's definition of anti-Semitism. And the response to that adoption was quite surprising, because you found Also, some right-wing libertarians come out against it because they see it as an assault on, well, the generous reading is because they see it as an assault on free speech. More cynical reading is they worry it will establish certain standards for suppressing speech that will be turned against them. But either way, you've seen, very pro-Israel stalwarts, Bret Stephens in the New York Times, this pro-Israel lawyer, Eugene Volokh, people like that you wouldn't expect necessarily, come out publicly against adopting that pro-Israel propagandistic definition of anti-Semitism. And here in Britain, obviously concerns about suppression of protest. That's of interest to the climate movement, to anyone who wants to retain space for democratic participation, freedom of assembly, and so on. But there's this balance that always has to be struck between being open to those opportunities to resonate with those broader constituencies, but not allowing that to then distract from the core, the core issue of what's happening in Gaza. And I've seen students in the US and Britain trying to navigate that balance, and I think they've been doing a really good job of it. And so I hope that continues.
Thank you, Jamie. Norman, I'll give you the final word and then we'll close there.
My final word is to the folks in the encampment. You are at a crossroads in your life. There are very serious sacrifices you're making, not just in the present, but possibly will have repercussions for your future. And I recognize how difficult those decisions must be for you. But I would say that, speaking for myself and speaking for maybe in some way a generation, I don't recall anyone later in life having expressed any significant regrets for the sacrifices they made as young people in order to try to make the world a better place. So my only solace to you is to say that one day, if and when we pass this horror, and if and not if, but when you reach middle age and old age, I find it very improbable that you will regret the kinds of decisions you have made now. They can cause inconvenience, for sure. They can lower your grade average, for sure. They may deny you ability to get into the graduate school that you wanted to get into, or the professional school, the law school, and the medical school. I will not deny any of those things, and I will not pretend that they are trivial or insignificant. I believe, because I'm kind of old-fashioned, they are important and most significant. However, I also believe that looking back, you will not regret the decision you made. Quite the contrary, even if your politics have radically changed when you enter middle age, even if your politics are radically changed, there will still be a part of you that was proud of what you did.